It was late at night. The highway was completely empty. Only the car's headlights cutting through the dark, and a narrow road leading deep into the woods. Suddenly, the GPS rerouted. On the screen, a new name flickered, Maple Hollow. It was the first time the driver had ever heard that name. And the strange thing was, this town had never appeared on any map. The moment he turned, the air grew colder. The signal began to weaken, and a heavy silence filled the car. Ahead, there was only darkness, and in the distance, a faint glow of a town's lights. Through the car's windshield, a faint light flickered through the fog. The driver squinted his eyes, and slowly, a sign came into view. An old wooden board, with rusted iron letters that read, "Welcome to Maple Hollow." But the strange thing was, half the letters were chipped away. Some alphabets could only be guessed, as if the board had been standing there for 40 to 50 years, and no one had ever bothered to replace it. The driver slowed down. The car crept past the sign, and he noticed, beneath the board was a small, rusted plate. It read, "Population 316. But the number 316 had been crossed out with rough lines. And beneath it, faintly scribbled in marker, was the number 0. The driver's throat went dry. He whispered under his breath, "What kind of town is this?" The road led straight into the town. The fog was still so thick, the headlights barely cut through it. On the left side, there were small houses, broken picket fences. A curtain moved in one of the windows, as if someone was watching. But when he focused, there was nothing there. On the right side, an old gas station stood. A single light bulb dangled, flickering on and off. The office cabin's window was shattered, and inside, pure darkness. Only the howling wind could be heard. The driver pulled the car over and stepped toward the pump. The smell of gasoline filled the air. He lifted the nozzle. Surprisingly, it worked. While the tank was filling, he looked around. The ground was littered with old wrappers, soda cans, all covered in thick dust, as if the station hadn't been used in 20 to 30 years. Then he noticed something. Inside the office cabin sat an old rocking chair. It was moving back and forth, slowly, creaking. But the cabin itself was completely empty. The driver's hand slipped, spilling gasoline. He quickly shoved the nozzle back and took a step toward the cabin. The chair was still rocking. The fog was seeping inside through the broken glass. And then, a cold gust of wind rushed past him, as if something had just sprinted by. Startled, he spun around. But the road was completely empty. When he got back into the car, he turned the key, engine started. But the radio switched on by itself. Amid the static, a voice came through. Faint, broken, distorted. "Welcome back, Maple Hollow." The driver quickly shut the radio off. But the screen kept changing frequencies on its own. Numbers flickered, and with every flicker, a new name appeared. All of them looked the same, like a missing persons list. And beneath each one, the words were written, "Last seen, Maple Hollow." The driver's heart pounded faster. He slammed the accelerator, racing forward. And within moments, an old diner building appeared ahead. The signboard read, "Open 24 hours. The lights were on. Shadows moved inside, as if someone was still serving customers. The driver stopped the car and whispered softly, "Looks like someone's still alive in this town." And he walked toward the diner. The driver pushed the diner's door open. The little bell chimed, and instantly, a cold draft hit his face. Inside, the lights glowed, tables were spotless. But on every table, plates were left behind. Half-eaten food, burgers with single bites missing, coffee cups half full. As if the customers had suddenly gotten up and left. The driver slowly stepped inside. Each step made the wooden floor creak beneath his shoes. And as he lifted his eyes, he saw a jukebox against the wall. The jukebox was running on its own, playing an old 70s track. But the music was warped and distorted, like an old cassette, damaged and broken. The driver's heartbeat raced faster. He called out, "Hello, is anyone here?" Suddenly, from behind the counter, a waiter appeared. White uniform, though the fabric was old and faded. His face pale, his eyes empty, no pupils at all, and his cheeks sunken in. The waiter stared straight at him and said only one word: "Welcome back." The driver froze, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Back. But this is my first time here." The waiter remained silent, gave no response. He simply turned back slowly toward the counter, lifted a tray, and placed a coffee cup in front of him. The driver hesitated, but sat down at the chair across. He picked up the cup, and as he peered inside, it wasn't steaming coffee, but the reflection of a pale, lifeless corpse staring back. The driver jolted, dropping the cup. The liquid spilled across the floor, and instantly, the lights began to flicker. Screams erupted through the entire diner, as if thousands of voices were crying out at once. The windows shook violently, the jukebox spun into fast forward. The driver covered his ears and shouted, "What's happening here?" Then in a split second, silence returned. The lights steadied, the music stopped, the screams vanished. The driver looked, the counter was completely empty. The waiter was gone. Only an old newspaper lay there. He picked it up. The headline read, "Maple Hollow. Entire town disappears overnight." The date beneath it was 1971. The driver's hands began to tremble. He folded the newspaper shut and caught his reflection in the window. But the reflection wasn't normal. His reflection's face looked older than his real one. Deep wrinkles carved across the skin, dark shadows under the eyes, as if 20 years had passed in a single moment. The driver staggered back, and suddenly, every light in the town went out at once. Darkness so heavy, he couldn't even see his own hands. And within that darkness, a single voice echoed, low, terrifying, "Why did you come back?" The darkness was so absolute, the driver couldn't see his own fingers. Panicking, he pulled out his car keys, pressed the tiny flashlight button. A weak beam flickered on, but it only stretched 2 or 3 feet ahead. The rest of the diner was swallowed in shadows. The driver hesitated, his voice shaking. "Who's there? Show yourself." The same voice replied, this time closer. "You should never have come back." The driver's throat went dry. He swung the flashlight toward the counter. And for a split second, he saw it. A silhouette standing there. Long hair hanging down, head bent low. But the moment the beam hit it directly, there was nothing there. The driver tried to step back, but his foot landed on a broken plate. Crash! The sound echoed through the entire diner. And with that sound, one by one, every plate and cup on the tables began to rattle, as if shoved by invisible hands. They all toppled to the floor, glass shattered, plates broke into pieces. And then, the jukebox turned on by itself. This time, no song played. Only a distorted male voice, repeating the same word over and over. "Leave. Leave. Leave." The driver shoved the diner's door open and bolted outside. But what he saw out there was even more horrifying. The spot where he had parked his car now lay covered in nothing but dust. The car was gone. He rubbed his eyes, looked again. The spot was completely empty. Only faint tire marks remained, like the car had never been there at all. Desperate, the driver screamed into the night. What the hell is happening here? At that moment, the streetlights ahead flickered on one by one. The road stretched deeper into the town. And on both sides, window curtains began to sway. Shadows moved behind them, as if the entire street was filled with people standing at their windows, watching him. Terrified, the driver slowly backed away. And then suddenly, a child's voice rang out. "Uncle, you came back." He swung his flashlight in that direction. And there stood a little girl, wearing a white dress, hair loose, feet bare. She smiled softly and said, "Didn't you remember me? You always used to come here." The driver's throat tightened. "Me? This is my first time." The girl cut him off. "No. It was you, that night, when everyone went to sleep and never woke up again." The driver stumbled back. What are you saying?" The girl locked her gaze directly on him. And suddenly, her smile froze. Her eyes turned completely black. She whispered, "Welcome back, Maple Hollow." And all the streetlights behind her went out at once. The driver could now see only the pale glow of the girl's face. Everything else was darkness. And echoing in his ears, that same haunting line, "Why did you come back?" The driver's throat was dry. He raised the flashlight straight at the little girl. But wherever the beam fell, her face kept shifting. One moment a small child, the next, an old woman, then nothing but an empty shadow. He blinked hard. And when he looked again, there was no one there at all. Only an old teddy bear lay on the ground. One ear torn, one button eye missing. The driver bent and picked up the teddy. The instant his hand touched it, a scream tore through his ears. Shrill, piercing, like a little girl screaming with every ounce of strength. He dropped the teddy immediately. And when he looked down, the teddy was gone. The driver steadied his breath and slowly began walking further down the street. Behind every window curtain, a shadow stirred. But all were silent, all simply watching him. He stopped in front of a house. The door was half open. Inside, a lantern burned faintly. The driver pushed the door and stepped inside. The house had old wooden floors. Family photos lined the walls. But there was something strange in every picture. Every single face was ruined. Some scratched out, some covered in black ink. The driver picked up a frame. The glass shattered, cutting his hand. And as he tried to wipe away the blood, his own face appeared in the photo. But his face too was scratched out, crossed over, as if he had already been erased. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed behind him. Thump. Thump. The driver swung his flashlight back and froze where he stood. On the stairs, a man stood, wearing an old sheriff's uniform. A badge on his chest, but his shirt was soaked in blood. His eyes glowed a deep red. The sheriff spoke slowly. "No one leaves Maple Hollow alive." And in the very next second, he leapt straight down the stairs. The driver screamed, slammed the door shut, and ran. As soon as he burst outside, every streetlight on the block flickered on at once. And now, all the curtains in the windows were gone. Inside every house, figures stood motionless. Dozens of faces, all staring straight at him, their eyes empty. And together, they spoke as one. "Why did you come back?" The driver's breath caught as he glanced behind him. The fog grew even thicker, and his chest pounded like it was about to split open. He screamed for help. "Somebody, please get me out of here." And at that exact moment, an old yellow school bus turned the corner. Its paint peeling, curtains swaying in the windows. The bus screeched to a halt, and its doors opened by themselves. Inside, there was only darkness. For a moment, the driver hesitated, then muttered under his breath, "Maybe this is the only way out of this town." And he slowly climbed aboard. His foot hit the metal steps. A loud, grating screech echoed. The bus felt ancient, rotting from within. The darkness inside was so heavy that only his flashlight carved out a small circle of light. The seat covers were torn open, foam spilling out, and the windows fogged up, as if someone had just been breathing there moments ago. Hesitant, the driver stepped deeper inside, and behind him, the doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. He spun around, tugged at the handle, but no matter how hard he pulled, the doors would not open. He moved forward slowly. From every corner of the bus, faint whispers echoed, sometimes from the left seats, sometimes from the right. He swung his flashlight. No one sat in the seats, but the voices kept going. Suddenly, the beam of light fell on one seat. A school bag lay there, half open, slipped to the floor. The driver picked it up. Inside was a notebook. The cover read, "Maple Hollow Elementary, Class of 1971. His hands trembled. He opened the notebook. Inside were children's signatures, their tiny doodles. And on the bottom of every page, the same chilling line, "Last day." Out of nowhere, laughter broke out from one of the seats. The driver snapped his flashlight toward it, and saw a little girl sitting there. The same one he had seen in the street. White dress, loose hair. She smiled and said, "Uncle, class is about to begin." The driver's eyes darted around in panic. And now every seat was filled. Children sat in rows, pale white faces, hollow eyes. All of them spoke in unison. "Roll call is starting." The driver yanked at the door, trying desperately to force it open. But the door was locked tight again. The whispers grew louder, sharper. From the roof came heavy thuds, thump, 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 as if someone was running above him. In the front mirror, he saw it. The driver's seat wasn't empty anymore. A skeletal figure sat there, a sheriff's badge hanging from its neck. It turned its hollow gaze straight into the mirror, and in a low voice whispered, "You belong here now." The driver's throat went dry. He threw the notebook to the ground and screamed, "I don't belong here." The moment he said it, the bus engine roared to life on its own. The entire frame shook violently. The windows rattled as thick fog consumed the outside. The lights flickered wildly, and the children screamed together, louder, over and over, "Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back." The driver clutched his seat in terror. And when he finally looked up, the bus was no longer on a road. It was driving into a place of pure darkness, fog swallowing everything. On either side stretched endless rows of graves, and on every gravestone, a name was carved. The very same names he had heard on the radio's missing persons list. Until he saw the last one. Michael Harris, last seen, Maple Hollow. The driver's heart froze. It was his own name. The bus jolted to a violent stop. And in the very next moment, everything went black. The driver's eyes slowly opened. Only a buzzing sound could be heard. And in the air, there was a strange burning rubber smell, like tires grinding to a stop. He looked around. The bus was completely empty inside. All the seats were once again covered in dust. No children, no skeleton driver. The driver started to step down. The door was now open. And where the bus had stopped, there was no road at all. Just an old drive-in theater. Long shut down. The screen torn, weeds on the ground, and speaker poles with wires dangling from them. He looked toward the screen. And in the darkness, the screen lit up on its own. The sound of a reel rolling, tack, 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 tack. And on the screen, a black and white film began to play. The film showed exactly what had just happened to him. The gas station, the diner, the girl, the bus, everything. The driver's throat went dry. He shouted, "Who are you? Why are you showing me this?" The screen blinked for a second. And now a message appeared on it. "You were always part of the story." From behind came the sound of footsteps. The driver switched on his flashlight and saw a man standing there, wearing a 60s style suit with a fedora hat. With a faint smile, he said, "The show has begun. Your seat is reserved." The driver stepped back in shock. And now the entire theater was filled with cars. All old 50s and 60s American cars. And inside them, people were sitting. But their faces were like masks. Blank, featureless, just smooth white skin. All of them stared at the screen together and repeated the same line. "Play the reel again, play the reel again." The driver ran toward one of the cars, peeked inside the window, and saw his own reflection. But the reflection was older, wearing 1970s style clothes and the same hollow darkness in the eyes. The driver screamed and stumbled back. And behind him stood the man with the fedora hat. He quietly said, "Don't look back, or you'll freeze too." And with that, he placed an old cinema ticket in the driver's hand. The ticket read, "Admit 1, Maple Hollow Drive-In, Final Show." The ticket began to burn in his hand. And on the screen, a new reel started to play. This time, a funeral scene. And inside the coffin lay someone. The driver forced his eyes to focus and saw it was himself in the coffin. The driver's breathing grew heavier. On the screen, the same scene kept repeating. The coffin opening, and his own face inside. Then suddenly, the reel stopped. Tack, 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 the projector went silent. And the entire theater was drowned in deep silence. The driver tried to throw the ticket away, but it had stuck to his skin, as if it had been burned and pressed into his flesh. Smoke began rising from his hand. And screaming, he ran through the rows of cars. Inside every car, the people's faces had changed. Once they were blank masks. Now they were all staring at him. Their eyes pitch black, and their lips moved together. "You can't leave the show. You can't leave the show." The driver tried to open a car door to climb inside. But the moment he looked in, the entire car interior had transformed into an operating room. Surgical lights, white sheets. And in the center, a dead body covered with a sheet. He lifted the sheet and once again saw his own face. The driver shut his eyes. When he opened them, he was back in the middle of the theater. But now, in front of the stage, a concession stand had lit up. A popcorn machine, a candy counter, Coke bottles. From behind came the voice of a little girl. "Do you want popcorn, Uncle, or candy?" It was the same little girl, in the white frock. But now blood was dripping from her lips. And in her hand was a burning popcorn bag. She handed the bag to him. And when the driver looked inside, among the popcorn, tiny teeth were scattered. The driver dropped the bag and started running. At the back of the theater was an old projection booth. He climbed the stairs up, opened the door. Inside, a projector was running without any reel. And sitting on a chair in front of it, the sheriff, that same skeleton-like man. He pointed his bony finger at the projector and quietly said, "Every reel's end is a new beginning." The driver peered into the projector, and suddenly his face was pulled straight into the screen. The screen blinked once. And now in the film reel appeared an old American Main Street. Shuttered shops, a bell tower, and in the middle a sign. Welcome to Maple Hollow, population 0. And from within that reel, the driver himself broke through, crashing out onto the road, as if he had shattered the screen and stepped into a new world. The driver slowly brushed the dust off his clothes, but beneath his feet was no normal road. It was the old Main Street. Cracked sidewalks, broken neon signs, and dust swirling in the air. In front of him stood a large welcome board. Welcome to Maple Hollow, population 0. He began to move forward. Shops on both sides were closed. Barber shop, general store, pharmacy, all their glass shattered. And in the air lingered a strange smell, like burning wood mixed with old iron. From far away came the sound of a church bell. Dong! 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 The driver began moving toward the bell tower, and saw an old clock tower church. Its door was slightly open. When he pushed it, inside were dozens of benches, and on all of them sat mannequins. White dummies, blank faces, and all of them had their heads turned in the direction where he was standing. The driver's heart started pounding fast. He tried to step back slowly, but the mannequins' necks began to turn with a click, 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 following him. Suddenly, from behind the pulpit came a voice. "You're too late, the service is over." The driver shone his flashlight and saw a priest standing there, but his face was like a melting wax mask. Hollow pits where his eyes should have been. The priest raised his hand and said, "Those who come here never leave, and neither will you." And all the mannequins in the church stood up at once. The thump, thump, thump of their footsteps echoed through the hall. The driver ran out the back of the church. There was a graveyard. Old crooked tombstones, some with names, some blank. He cast his torchlight on one tombstone, and it read, "In loving memory of James Holloway, died 1971. The driver's eyes went wide. It was his own name. He looked at a third tombstone. It read, "Gone but not forgotten, James Holloway, died 1991. And then another. "Rest in peace, James Holloway, died 2011. Every few years, a new tombstone. All with his name. The driver screamed and fell back. And behind him stood the little girl in the white frock. But this time, she was holding a lantern. She softly said, "You never truly died, you're always called back." The driver asked, "Who are you? Why is this happening to me?" The girl only smiled and lifted the lantern. And where her light fell, in the middle of the graveyard was a freshly dug grave. Beside it lay a coffin, still closed. The driver slowly approached it, opened the coffin lid, and inside he saw himself, but this time alive. His duplicate, who opened his eyes and looked straight at him. The duplicate driver slowly reached out his hand and grabbed the real driver's wrist. The touch was ice cold, but the grip was tight, like an iron chain. The duplicate's eyes were exactly the same as his, but inside them spun an entire city. Old houses, burning lights, and in every window, the same face. The driver's own face. The duplicate whispered softly, "Now you must take my place here, complete the cycle." The driver yanked his hand free and stumbled back. But the duplicate rose out of the coffin, and now they stood face to face. The ground began to shake violently. Buildings behind the graveyard collapsed, and a humming filled the air. Whispering voices, overlapping. "Stay here. Stay here. Stay here." The driver tried to run, but the duplicate blocked his path. He said, "Every time you run, And every time you come back here, now it's your turn to die here." The driver screamed and ran through the middle of the graveyard, but slipped and fell into an open pit. At the bottom was an old subway tunnel. Iron rails, broken lights, and a thick, damp stench in the air. The driver turned on his flashlight and saw posters lining the walls on both sides. Each poster was of a missing person, with dates ranging from 1950 up to 2020. And under every poster was written, "Last seen in Maple Hollow." The driver looked closely at the posters and collapsed in shock. Every single poster had his own face. Each decade, a new photo, a new missing date. From behind came a sound. A train was approaching. But it wasn't a normal train. Inside its windows sat mannequins. And now all the mannequins' faces had turned into his own duplicates. The train screeched to a halt. The door opened. And the mannequins all spoke in unison. "Welcome back home." The driver tried to slam the door shut, but one mannequin grabbed him and dragged him inside. And the train slowly began to move. The train moved deeper into the tunnel, but the seats and windows inside began to change. Everything dissolved into an old classroom. On the blackboard it was written, "Lesson 1, Nobody Leaves Maple Hollow." And on the teacher's chair sat the same little girl in the white frock. This time, she held a bell in her hand. She rang it, trang, trang, trang. And as soon as the bell rang, every desk in the classroom popped open. Inside each desk was a small coffin, and all the lids began to slowly shift open. The driver's heart nearly stopped. He lifted the lid of the nearest desk. Inside was a smaller version of himself. His childhood face, eyes wide open, whispering softly, "Class never ends." The driver turned around. And now from every coffin in the classroom, multiple versions of him were crawling out. From childhood to old age. Every duplicate of himself. The driver stepped back. The classroom looked small, but with every step it stretched longer. The walls pulling back, the floor dragging further. In front of him, his younger and older versions formed a circle around him. The child version giggled and said, "You ran before, but still you came back." The teenage version held an old yearbook. He opened it and shoved it in the driver's face. Every page filled only with his picture. And beneath each one, the same line, "Most likely to never leave." The driver screamed and shoved the classroom door open. He stumbled into a long corridor. On both sides stood rows of lockers, all marked Maple Hollow High School, property of James Holloway. When he tried to open one locker, a skeleton fell out. It slowly looked up at him and said, "You've taken my place, now you can't leave." The lockers began creaking open one by one. And from each locker, more duplicates of him stepped out. Suddenly, at the end of the corridor, a fire alarm blared. Ring! 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 And the whole building began to shake. The driver ran outside. And in front of him was a massive football field. Floodlights blazing, but the audience seats empty. In the middle of the field stood an old scoreboard. It flickered with the words, "Home, Maple Hollow, 99, visitor, 0. The driver froze in shock. He saw his own name written beneath, next to the 0 under visitor. From the corner of the field, loudspeakers crackled on. An announcer's voice echoed, "Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome him once again. James Holloway." The floodlights across the field blinked in sequence. And suddenly the stands filled with mannequins, all clapping together. Clap. 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 The driver was shoved into the center of the field. And before him stood a full football team. But every player was his duplicate. Inside the pads and helmets, his own face. Together they chanted, "The game never ends." The driver tried to run, but the ground beneath the field turned soft, as if it wasn't dirt but flesh. His feet began sinking into it. When he looked down, thousands of hands reached out from beneath. Every hand was another duplicate of himself, all pulling him down, dragging him deeper. The driver screamed, and one last time, he looked up at the sky. The scoreboard numbers changed. Home, Maple Hollow, 100, visitor, -1. And the screen went completely black. The driver opened his eyes, and he found himself lying on a bed in an old hospital ward. White walls, rusty bed frames, and fluorescent lights flickering every second. Beside him was a clipboard. On the file it was written, "Patient name, James Holloway, admitted since 1971. The driver's mind spun out of control. He kept reading his name again and again. James Holloway. I'm not James. Just then, the curtain slid open, and a nurse walked in, her face hidden by a surgical mask. But in her eyes was the same duplicate darkness. The nurse whispered softly, "Only the names change, the cycle never does." From the hallway came the squeaking sound of stretcher wheels. The driver climbed off the bed and looked. 2 orderlies were wheeling in an old corpse stretcher, and lying on it was his own body. The corpse's eyes were wide open, and it whispered faintly, "You're next in line." The driver screamed and bolted down the hallway. But every door he opened led only to another ward. And in each ward, different versions of himself lay as patients. One missing an arm, another with his head bandaged, another with no face at all. All of them turned their heads toward him and said, "We've been waiting for you." The driver kept running until he stumbled into an operating theater. At the center stood a large surgical table. Overhead, surgical lights beamed down onto his face. And standing in front of him was a doctor. The doctor wore a mask. But as he pulled it down, the driver's heart nearly stopped. It was himself again, but older, nearly 70. White beard, wrinkled face, and his eyes completely hollow. The doctor version said, "Now you must understand, you are not new here, you've always been here." The doctor lifted surgical tools and forced him onto the table. The driver screamed, kicking wildly, but the straps tightened around him. The lights grew brighter. And suddenly, the operating theater dissolved into a movie theater. A projector was running. On the screen played a film. In the film, the same driver was driving down the highway, exactly like the beginning of the story. Radio on, empty diner, ghost town. Everything repeating itself again. The driver stared at the screen in terror. And from inside the projector, another duplicate of himself stepped out, holding a camera. The duplicate raised the camera toward the real driver and said, "Lights. Camera. Action. Welcome back to Maple Hollow." The projector's spotlight blinded the driver. On the screen, his own face zoomed in. But behind him, the audience seats began to fill on their own. First mannequins. Then flesh began to grow over the mannequins. And slowly, they all turned into real humans. But every single face was his duplicate. The audience began clapping in unison. Clap. 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 As if he was standing trial for his own existence. A spotlight lit up on stage. And there stood an old theater director. Black suit, top hat. And in his hand, a golden megaphone. Through the megaphone, the director said, "Every story needs a protagonist. And you are the hero of Maple Hollow. But every hero's place is eventually taken by the next." The driver screamed out, I'm not a hero. I was just passing through. The director laughed, and through the megaphone said, "That's what they all say. But when the credits roll, the name is always James Holloway." Suddenly, the projector reel changed. On the screen played clips of old travelers. From the 1970s to the 2000s. Truck drivers, families, tourists. All entering the highway the same way, stopping at the diner, and then vanishing into Maple Hollow. And at the end of every video, only one line flashed. Starring James Holloway. The driver's mind was shattering. He screamed out, "I'm not one of them. I'm not James." Then the projector screen tore open, and a black liquid shadow spilled out, latching onto him. The liquid began forcing its way into his face. His duplicate versions rose from the audience seats, walking toward him one by one. All their lips moved together. "You are James. You've always been James. And you can never leave this place." With all his strength, the driver ripped free from the black liquid's grip and ran. He bolted through the theater's back door and found himself in a cemetery. On every grave was the same name. James Holloway. Sometimes 1910, sometimes 1950, sometimes 2001. Every decade, another grave of James Holloway. Beneath his own feet was a freshly dug grave. On the gravestone it was written, "James Holloway, 2023, rest in Maple Hollow." The driver's breath stopped cold. And behind him, the director's voice echoed, "The final act has begun." The driver staggered backward. But from both sides of the grave, bony hands began breaking out of the earth. Dozens of skeletal arms pulling him down into the dirt. Screaming, he turned and ran toward the cemetery gates. At the gate, the same little girl in the white frock was standing. This time, in her hand was an old diary. She dropped the diary in front of the driver. The driver picked it up. And on the very first page, it was written, "Diary of James Holloway, 1871. Beneath it were thousands of pages. And on every single page it read, "I tried to escape, but I was wrong." The driver wanted to tear the diary apart and throw it away. But his hands froze in place. And the pages began to flip on their own. All of them fluttering together into a black whirlwind. The pages dissolved into the air and formed a gigantic shadow figure. That shadow covered the entire cemetery. Its eyes glowed like blinding floodlights. And its voice rumbled like thunder. Maple Hollow is not a town, it is the stage. And you are the new mask for every act. Terrified, the driver screamed, "I won't become James. I'll break the cycle." He grabbed a cross lying near a grave and hurled it at the shadow. But the cross burned to ashes mid-air. The shadow laughed and said, "You don't understand, resistance is also part of the script." All the cemetery gravestones began cracking at once. And from them rose the corpses of the old James Holloways. Each one his own duplicate. Some only skulls, others with half their flesh rotted away. But all of them said together, "Join us." The driver ran, bursting out of the cemetery gates, and found himself back on the main street of Maple Hollow. The board still read the same words. "Welcome to Maple Hollow, population 0. But now a new line had appeared beneath it. Starring tonight, James Holloway. The driver's body froze. He checked his pocket. The same cinema ticket was there. But now it read, "Finale show, no escape." The cemetery air grew colder. Fog so thick that he could only see 2 feet ahead. The driver peered into a freshly dug grave nearby and saw inside it a mirrored coffin. The coffin's glass was perfectly clear. Inside it, the driver's reflection stared back at him. But the reflection was static, it didn't move at all. When the driver lifted his hand, the reflection did not. It only smiled. And slowly, its lips moved. "You are already inside." The driver gripped the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, there was a flicker of relief on his face. But as soon as he looked at the GPS screen, the screen read, "Destination reached, Maple Hollow." His heart sank all over again. I'm still on the highway, and yet Maple Hollow? On the side of the road, the same yellow school bus was parked again. But this time, the bus lights were on. Inside, silhouettes of children could be seen. One by one, the children pressed their faces against the windows. But their faces, all of them were his duplicates. Little James Holloways. All of them laughing in unison, chanting, "Come join the class." The driver shut his eyes and slammed the accelerator. But the bus never fell behind. The faster he drove, the faster the bus followed. Suddenly, his headlights landed on a massive drive-in movie theater. On the theater screen, a film was playing. And the hero of the film was the driver himself. The scene was exactly what was happening on the highway right now. The bus, the fog, and his own screams echoing. Shocked, the driver stopped his car and slowly walked toward the glowing screen. On the screen, a close-up of his face appeared. But the driver on the screen looked directly at him and said, "You're not watching the film. You are the film." Suddenly, the sound of applause erupted behind him. When the driver turned around, all the empty car seats of the theater were now filled with spectators. And every single spectator's face was his duplicate. They all stood together, cheering in unison. "James! James!" His sanity shattered completely. He tried to force himself into the screen. And the moment he touched it, his body began to dissolve, turning into strips of celluloid film, absorbed into the screen itself. On the screen, the credits began to roll. Directed by James Holloway. Starring James Holloway. Written by James Holloway. And the final line read, "In loving memory of all who tried to escape." Above the theater, a neon sign flickered on. "Now playing forever, Maple Hollow." On the highway, a new car entered. A new traveler, the radio clicked on. And after the static, the same line repeated, "Welcome to Maple Hollow."